The light between houses. Margaret Hale had come to understand, over the course of the last 11 years, that silence was not a single thing, but a collection of smaller, more particular silences, each with its own weight and temperature, its own faint texture against the skin. There was the early morning silence, for instance, which carried the coolness of night still clinging to the walls, the faint ticking of the kitchen clock amplified into something almost companionable. And there was the afternoon silence, heavier, dust-laden, stretching long across the floors as the light angled through the tall windows and settled into the worn grain of the wood. But the silence that troubled her most, the one she could not quite name, was the evening silence that came after she had washed her single plate and set it carefully in the rack, after she had turned off the small lamp beside the sofa and stood for a moment with her hand resting on its shade as though confirming its absence. That silence did not settle, it hovered. It was during one of these evenings, in late October, when the air had begun to carry the faint metallic scent of approaching frost, that she first noticed the sound. At first, it was so slight that she thought it might be something within her own house, the expansion of pipes, perhaps, or the slow complaint of old wood adjusting to the dropping temperature. The house, after all, was nearly a century old, its floors uneven in places, its walls layered with paint that held within them, she sometimes felt, the faint residue of other lives. But this sound was different. It was a rhythm, not steady exactly, but persistent enough to draw her attention away from the book resting open on her lap. A footstep, she thought, though it seemed unlikely given the distance between her home and the one next door. The houses sat perhaps 15 feet apart, their narrow yards bordered by a sagging wooden fence that leaned just enough to suggest long neglect. She listened more closely. There it was again, faint, muffled, as though carried through something softer than air. A step, then another, slightly heavier, a pause, and then the sound of something being set down, a chair perhaps, or a box. Margaret closed her book, though she did not mark her place, and tilted her head slightly, as if the angle might bring the sound into clearer focus. "It's nothing," she said aloud, her voice sounding thinner than she intended in the dim room, but even as she spoke she knew it was not nothing. The house next door had been empty for nearly 3 years. Before that, an older couple had lived there, quiet people, the kind who waved from a distance but never approached. When they left, the house had seemed to exhale, as though relieved of its obligation to contain them. And now someone was there. Margaret rose slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in her knees, and crossed the room to the window. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, a sound she had long ago stopped noticing, but which now seemed suddenly intrusive, as though it might betray her presence. She parted the curtain just enough to see. The house next door was mostly dark, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the street lamp at the corner. But in the front room, just visible through the thin branches of the maple tree that stood between the properties, there was a light. It was not bright. It had the dim yellowed quality of an old bulb, casting more shadow than illumination. And within that light she thought she saw movement. A figure, perhaps, passing briefly across the window before disappearing again. Margaret let the curtain fall back into place. "Well," she said softly, though there was no one to hear her, "so it begins." She did not know exactly what she meant by that, only that something had shifted, however slightly, in the careful arrangement of her days. That night The sound continued intermittently, footsteps, the dragging of something heavy, the dull thud of objects being set down, not loud enough to be called disruptive, but present enough that she could not entirely ignore it. She lay in bed longer than usual, the covers pulled up to her chin, listening. At one point, she found herself counting the intervals between the sounds, as though they might reveal a pattern, a logic she could understand. But they did not. They came and went with a kind of quiet unpredictability, like someone pacing without purpose, and in the space between those sounds the silence felt thinner, less complete. She turned onto her side, facing the wall that separated her bedroom from the outside, and closed her eyes. But even then she was aware of it, that faint, persistent presence just beyond her own, not close enough to touch, but no longer distant. Thomas Avery had not intended to move there. That was the truth of it, though he suspected that if anyone had asked him directly, he might have offered a different version, something more deliberate, more orderly, as though the decision had followed a clear line from one point to another. But in reality, it had been less a decision than a narrowing, a series of small concessions that had gradually brought him to this place, this house, with its slightly sagging porch and its windows that did not quite close properly, where the wind found its way in through thin, persistent seams. He arrived in the late afternoon, the sky already beginning to dim in that particular way it did in autumn, when the lights seemed to withdraw rather than fade. The moving truck had left less than an hour earlier, its departure marked by a sudden, almost disorienting quiet. Boxes were stacked in uneven clusters throughout the house, their contents labelled in his own handwriting, though the words seemed to carry less meaning now that they had been translated into this new space. Kitchen, books, clothes. Each label felt like a reduction, a simplification of things that had once been part of a larger, more continuous life. He stood for a long time in the centre of the living room, his hands resting loosely at his sides, listening. The house had its own sounds, as all houses did. A faint hum from somewhere within the walls, the occasional tick of cooling pipes, the soft rustle of air moving through spaces not entirely sealed. But beyond that, there was something else. At first, he thought it was the echo of his own movements, delayed slightly, as though the house were reluctant to release the memory of them. But then he realized it was coming from outside, or perhaps, more precisely, from next door, a floorboard creaking. A faint shifting sound, like someone adjusting their weight in a chair. He turned his head slightly, orienting himself toward the source. So, there was someone there. He had not given much thought to the neighbouring houses when he first came to see the property. They had seemed distant, separate, each contained within its own small plot of land. But now, standing in the quiet of the room, he became aware of the subtle ways in which proximity asserted itself, not through sight, but through sound. He took a step forward, his foot landing more heavily than he intended. The floor responded with a low, drawn-out creak. He paused. Then, almost without thinking, he took another step, this time more deliberately. Another creak. It occurred to him, with a faint and somewhat unexpected irritation, that the sound might carry, that whoever lived next door might hear him moving about, might already be forming some impression of him based solely on these small, involuntary noises. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had grown accustomed, over the past few years, to a kind of anonymity that bordered on invisibility. The apartment he had left behind, on the third floor of a building that always smelled faintly of cooking oil and old carpet, had offered him that. There had been neighbours, certainly, but they existed mostly as distant presences, their lives suggested only by the occasional muffled conversation or the brief impersonal nod in the hallway. Here it seemed things might be different. He moved toward the window and looked out. The yard was small, bordered by a fence that leaned slightly to one side, as though it had given up the effort to stand straight. Beyond it, the neighbouring house stood in quiet stillness, its windows dark except for one, a soft yellow glow that suggested someone was awake. He watched it for a moment. There was no movement, no visible figure, but the light itself felt like a kind of presence, steady and unblinking. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, what it was like to be on the other side of such a light, to be the one observed, even if only indirectly. He stepped back from the window. "Well," he said, though the word carried no particular conviction. "That's that." He turned his attention to the boxes, selecting one at random and kneeling beside it. The cardboard was cool beneath his hands, the tape pulling away with a soft tearing sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet room. As he unpacked, he became aware of his own movements in a way that felt unfamiliar, each gesture slightly exaggerated, each sound more pronounced than it would have been in a space already filled with life. At one point, he set a ceramic mug down on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. The resulting clink echoed briefly, and then, almost immediately, a sound from next door, a shift, a pause, as though someone had noticed. Thomas stood still, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter. For a moment, he considered the possibility that the sound had been coincidental, that it bore no relation to his own. But the timing felt too precise, too aligned to be dismissed entirely. He exhaled slowly. "This is ridiculous," he murmured, and yet he found himself moving more carefully after that, placing objects down with deliberate gentleness, as though attempting to minimize his presence, as though it were possible to remain, in some essential way, unheard. Later that evening, as the light outside faded completely, and the street lamp flickered on with a faint, intermittent buzz, both houses settled into their separate silences. Margaret, sitting once again by her window, held her cup of tea longer than necessary, the warmth seeping gradually into her fingers. Across the narrow stretch of yard, the light in the neighbouring house remained on, and though neither of them could see the other clearly, each was aware, if only faintly, of a presence just beyond the edge of their own, not yet known, not yet understood, but there. By the third morning, Margaret had already begun to rearrange her expectations in small, almost imperceptible ways, as though making space within herself for something she had not invited but could no longer ignore. She woke earlier than usual, before the light had fully gathered in the sky, and lay still for a moment, listening, not for anything in particular, she told herself, but simply because she was awake. The room held its familiar chill, the kind that settled into the sheets overnight and lingered there, reluctant to be displaced. Somewhere within the walls, a pipe gave a low hollow knock, followed by silence, and then there it was again, not loud, not insistent, but present, a step, slow, measured, then another. Margaret opened her eyes. The sound seemed closer in the morning, though she knew this could not be true. Perhaps it was simply that the rest of the world had not yet begun its daily clamour, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional passing voice, so that what remained was clearer, more defined. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and turned her head slightly toward the wall. "Up early," she murmured, though whether she meant herself or the unseen neighbour, she could not say. There was something about the rhythm of the footsteps that unsettled her, not because they were irregular, but because they were deliberate, as though each step were chosen rather than taken. She rose, her feet meeting the cold floor with a small, involuntary intake of breath, and moved toward the kitchen. The house greeted her as it always did, with a sequence of soft acknowledgments, the creak of the third board from the doorway, the faint rattle of the cabinet door that never quite aligned with its frame, the low hum of the refrigerator. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then stood for a moment with her hands resting lightly on the counter, listening again. The footsteps had stopped. In their place, a different sound emerged, a dull, rhythmic tapping, as though something were being set down, lifted, and set down again. Margaret frowned slightly. "What on earth?" she said under her breath. She imagined a man, though she had no particular reason to do so, moving about the room next door, placing objects in uncertain positions, then reconsidering, adjusting, trying again. There was something tentative in the sound, something that suggested not just movement, but hesitation. The kettle began to hum softly, the water inside shifting toward a boil. Margaret reached for the cupboard, took down a single cup, and paused with it in her hand. For a moment, just a moment, she considered making two. The thought came without warning, as though it had slipped in through some unguarded part of her mind. It lingered there, faintly absurd, and yet not entirely without weight. She set the cup on the counter. "No," she said quietly, with a small shake of her head, as though correcting herself. The kettle whistled. She poured the water, watching as the steam rose in thin, wavering strands, then carried the cup to the window. The yard lay still beneath a pale, uncertain light. The grass, thin and uneven, held a faint sheen of moisture, and the fence, tilted as it was, cast a narrow, distorted shadow across the ground. The neighbouring house stood as it had the night before, its presence both ordinary and newly significant. One window, just one, was lit. Margaret leaned slightly closer, though she knew the angle would not allow her to see inside. The glass reflected more of her own dim kitchen than it revealed of the space beyond. Still, she watched. After a moment, the light shifted, just slightly, as though someone had moved between it and the window. A figure, brief, indistinct, and then gone. Margaret felt a small tightening in her chest, not entirely unpleasant, but not comfortable either. A kind of alertness that she had not experienced in some time. "Well," she said again, though the word felt thinner now, less certain. She lifted the cup to her lips, but did not drink. Instead, she stood there, holding it, the warmth gradually fading from the porcelain into her hands, as the light across the way remained steady. Later that morning, as she stepped outside to collect the mail, a habit she maintained even on days when she knew there would be nothing waiting for her, she became aware, almost immediately, of the other presence. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The street remained quiet, the houses on either side closed up in their own routines. Margaret walked slowly down the narrow path that led to the mailbox at the edge of her yard, her shoes making a soft, uneven sound against the worn concrete. As she reached for the small metal door, she heard it, a movement behind her, not loud, not abrupt, but unmistakable. She turned, The man stood in his yard, near the fence, his posture slightly bent forward, as though he had been in the act of doing something and had paused. In one hand he held a small cardboard box. His other hand rested lightly on the top of the fence, fingers curled over the weathered wood. For a moment neither of them spoke. Margaret became acutely aware of the space between them, not large, but significant. The fence, leaning as it was, seemed less a barrier than a suggestion of one, its uneven slats allowing glimpses of what lay beyond. "Good morning," she said at last, her voice measured, polite. The man straightened slightly. "Morning," he replied. His voice was lower than she expected, and carried a faint roughness, as though it had not been used much recently. They regarded one another for a moment longer. "You've moved in," Margaret said, though it was obvious. "Yes." A pause. "Recently." "Yes." Another pause. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, aware of the way the conversation seemed to hover, uncertain of its direction. "Well," she said, "the house has been empty for some time." "I gathered that." His gaze moved briefly toward the house behind her, then back again. "It needed some attention." Margaret nodded, though she did not elaborate. There were many things she might have said about the house, about its history, its particular tendencies, but none of them seemed appropriate in that moment. "Yes," she said instead, "they often do." The man adjusted his grip on the box. "Thomas," he said after a moment, as though the name had taken some effort to produce. "Margaret." Another pause, and then, almost simultaneously, they both seemed to reach the same conclusion, that there was nothing further to be said just then. "Well," Margaret said, with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," Thomas replied. She turned back toward the house, aware of his presence behind her, of the faint shift of his weight as he resumed whatever it was he had been doing. As she closed the door behind her, the house seemed to receive her differently than it had before, not changed exactly, but altered in some subtle way she could not yet name. She stood for a moment in the entryway, her hand resting on the door. "Thomas," she repeated softly. The name felt unfamiliar in her mouth, as though it belonged to a different context, a different life, and yet it lingered. Thomas had not expected the woman next door to speak first. In fact, he had imagined, without fully realizing that he had done so, that she would remain at a distance, a figure glimpsed occasionally through a window or across the yard, acknowledged perhaps with a brief nod, but otherwise contained within the boundaries of her own life. But when she had turned and said, "Good morning," there had been something in her voice, not warmth exactly, but a kind of steady presence that unsettled his expectations. "Margaret," she had said. He repeated the name silently as he carried the box back into the house, setting it down on the kitchen table with a care that bordered on unnecessary. Margaret. It was not a name he associated with anyone in particular, and yet it seemed to carry with it a certain weight, a quiet solidity. He moved slowly through the house, opening another box, then another, though he found that his attention drifted more than it had the previous day. The encounter, brief as it had been, lingered. He found himself replaying it in small fragments. The way she had stood, her shoulders slightly drawn in, as though guarding against something. The careful neutrality of her tone, the way she had said his name, not warmly, but not dismissively either. There had been, he thought, a kind of restraint in her, but also something else. He could not quite name it. He unpacked a set of plates, placing them in the cabinet one by one, aligning them more precisely than necessary. The motion was familiar, almost soothing, though it did little to quiet the subtle restlessness that had settled in him since the morning. At one point he found himself pausing, his hand hovering over the counter, listening. There was no sound from next door, no footsteps, no movement, only the low steady hum of his own house. He exhaled slowly. "Of course," he said, though the word carried a faint edge of irritation. He was aware, even as he spoke, that the irritation was disproportionate to its cause. There was no reason to expect sound, no reason to anticipate any particular pattern of movement from a person he did not know, and yet the absence of it felt like something, as though a presence once noticed could not simply be unnoticed. He moved to the window, standing in roughly the same position he had occupied the night before. The yard lay quiet, the fence casting its thin, uneven shadow across the ground. The neighbouring house stood in its usual stillness, its windows dark now in the full light of day. He watched for a moment, and then, just as he was about to turn away, movement, Margaret stepping out onto her porch, a small cloth in her hand. She paused there, looking out toward the street, then began to wipe the railing in slow, deliberate motions. Thomas remained where he was, aware of the way his presence, though unseen, felt suddenly more pronounced. There was something about the way she moved that held his attention, not because it was unusual, but because it was precise. Each gesture seemed considered, as though she were not merely cleaning, but performing an action she had performed many times before, one that required no thought, and yet was not entirely without intention. He watched as she reached the end of the railing, paused, then went back over a section she had already cleaned. A small thing, but noticeable. He felt unexpectedly a faint flicker of recognition, not of the action itself, but of the impulse behind it, the need to repeat, to correct, to ensure that something had been done properly, even when no one else would see it. He stepped back from the window. "This is absurd," he said quietly, and yet he did not entirely believe it. That afternoon the sky remained overcast, the light diffused into a soft, even grey that flattened the edges of things. The temperature dropped slightly, and with it came a dampness that seemed to settle into the wood of the house, bringing with it a faint musty scent. Margaret sat in her usual chair, a book open but unread in her lap. From time to time she glanced toward the window, not directly, but in the way one checks something without wanting to appear as though one is checking. The house next door remained quiet. Too quiet, she thought. She shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the blanket draped over her knees. "Well," she murmured, "he can't be making noise all the time." The words sounded reasonable, and yet she found herself listening, not for anything specific, but for the possibility of something, a step, a creak, the faintest indication that the presence she had become aware of still existed in some tangible way. But there was nothing, only the soft ticking of the clock, the occasional whisper of wind against the windows, and beneath it all a quiet that felt, for reasons she could not quite articulate, more pronounced than it had before. She closed the book, though she had not turned a page. "Thomas," she said softly, testing the name again. It settled differently this time, not entirely unfamiliar, but not yet comfortable. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw movement across the way. But when she looked directly, There was nothing, only the reflection of her own room, faint and indistinct, layered over the glass. She sat there for a long time, her hands resting lightly on the closed book, the silence around her no longer singular, but divided, shared now, even in its absence. In the days that followed, a kind of quiet pattern began to form between the two houses, not one that could be easily described or even fully noticed at first, but something that lived in the edges of routine, in the spaces where attention lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Margaret did not think of it as watching, though there were times when she found herself standing by the window with no clear purpose, her hand resting against the frame, her gaze settling almost without intention on the neighbouring house. It was not curiosity exactly, nor concern, but something more diffuse, something that felt closer to recognition than to interest. She noticed, for instance, that Thomas kept his curtains half drawn during the day, as though unwilling to fully expose the interior of the house, yet not entirely committed to privacy either. The light inside shifted slowly, filtered through fabric that had likely once been white, but had softened into a muted, uncertain shade. In the mornings there were sounds again, not as frequent as that first night, but present enough that she began to anticipate them. A step, deliberate and measured, the faint scrape of a chair, once the low hollow sound of something dropped and then quickly retrieved, followed by a long pause, as though the act itself had required explanation. She found herself adjusting her own movements in response, not consciously, not at first, but gradually she became aware that she was placing her cup down more carefully, that she was closing drawers with a gentler hand, that even her footsteps seemed to soften, as though she were moving through a space that extended beyond the boundaries of her own house. One morning, as she stood at the sink rinsing her cup, she heard a distinct, sharp sound from next door. A cupboard door, perhaps, closed with more force than intended. Margaret paused, her hand still beneath the running water. There was something in that sound, something abrupt, uncontained, that caught her attention more than the quieter noises had. She turned her head slightly, listening. Silence followed. Then, after a moment, a single step, heavier than usual. Margaret reached for the towel, drying her hands slowly. "Well?" she said under her breath, though she did not finish the thought. She imagined him standing there, perhaps in the kitchen, his hands still resting on the cupboard door, aware, suddenly, uncomfortably, of the sound he had made. The idea settled in her with a faint, unexpected clarity. He is aware of me, not in any direct sense, not as one person is aware of another in conversation, but in the quieter way that presence makes itself known through the smallest of disturbances. The thought did not comfort her, but it did not entirely unsettle her either. It simply existed. That afternoon the light shifted toward a pale diluted gold, the kind that seemed less to illuminate than to reveal the thinness of the day as it moved toward evening. Margaret stepped outside with a small basket of laundry, the fabric cool and slightly stiff from having dried indoors. The air carried a faint chill, enough to make her draw her sweater more closely around her shoulders. She moved slowly across the yard, her shoes pressing softly into the uneven ground, and began to hang the clothes along the line that stretched between two posts near the fence. The act was familiar, practiced. Each movement followed the next without thought. The lifting of the cloth, the placement of the pin, the slight adjustment to ensure it hung evenly. But even within that familiarity, she found herself aware of something else, the house next door. She did not look directly. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift, to settle on the fence, on the tree, on the narrow strip of grass that separated the two properties, and then a sound, the back door of the neighbouring house opening. Margaret's hand paused in mid-air, a clothespin held lightly between her fingers. She did not turn immediately. There was a particular kind of awareness that came in such moments, not the sharp alertness of surprise, but a slower, more deliberate recognition of shared space. She placed the clothespin carefully, then lifted the next item from the basket. Behind her, she could hear the faint shift of footsteps on wood, then the softer sound of them meeting the ground. Thomas. She knew it without looking. There was something in the rhythm now that she had come to recognize, not precisely, but enough. He moved closer, though not directly toward her. Instead, he seemed to pause near the fence, his presence marked more by the absence of movement than by any clear action. Margaret hung another piece of laundry, and then, without quite deciding to do so, she turned. He stood a few feet away, on his side of the fence, his hands resting loosely at his sides. For a moment he appeared almost uncertain, as though he had stepped outside with a purpose that had since dissolved. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon." A brief silence followed, filled not with discomfort exactly, but with a kind of careful neutrality. "You're settling in," Margaret said, though again it was not quite a question. "Yes." He glanced briefly toward the line of laundry, then back again. "It's quieter than I expected." Margaret considered this. "Yes," she said, "it is." Another pause. "But not entirely," he added after a moment. Margaret felt a small, almost imperceptible tightening in her chest. "No," she said, "not entirely." Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment something passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but the faintest acknowledgement of something shared. Something unspoken. Margaret turned back to the laundry. "Well," she said, her voice returning to its usual measured tone. "It has its ways." Thomas nodded, though she did not see it. "Yes," he said quietly, "I suppose it does." The first real irritation came, as such things often did, from something so small that it seemed almost unreasonable to give it weight, and yet, once noticed, it could not be easily dismissed. It began in the evening, at that hour when the light had withdrawn completely, and the houses seemed to settle into themselves, each containing its own quiet, its own particular arrangement of thought and memory. Margaret had just set her cup in the sink, the faint scent of chamomile still lingering in the air, when she heard it, a sound from next door. At first she did not register it as anything distinct, only a low intermittent thudding, spaced unevenly, as though something were being moved across the floor. She paused, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. The sound came again, a drag, a soft thud, then another. Margaret frowned slightly. "What is he doing?" she murmured. She moved toward the living room, her steps quiet but purposeful, and stood near the wall that faced the neighbouring house. The sound continued, not constant but persistent enough that it began to take on a shape in her mind. A chair, perhaps, being shifted back and forth, or a table moved slightly out of place and then returned again. It was not loud, it did not disrupt the room in any obvious way, and yet it entered her awareness and remained there, refusing to dissolve into the background. Margaret crossed her arms lightly, her fingers pressing into the fabric of her sleeves. "Well," she said under her breath. "This won't do." The words surprised her, not because of their content, but because of the firmness with which they were spoken. She stood there for a moment longer, listening. The sound continued. Drag, thud, pause, drag. Something in its irregularity unsettled her. Not the volume, but the lack of pattern, the sense that it might continue indefinitely without resolution. She turned away, moving toward the chair by the window, and sat down. "It's nothing," she said aloud, though her voice carried a faint edge now. But even as she spoke, the sound came again, closer this time, or perhaps she was simply more attuned to it. She picked up her book, opened it, and stared at the page. The words did not settle. They seemed to float slightly, detached from their usual meaning. Another drag, a sharper thud. Margaret closed the book. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, louder now. The room received her voice and gave it back to her, softened as though unwilling to amplify it. She sat very still, her gaze fixed on the far wall, and then, without quite deciding to do so, she rose. Thomas had not realized how much noise the table would make. It was heavier than it looked, its legs uneven in a way that caused it to catch slightly against the floor each time he shifted it. He had intended only to move it a few inches, closer to the window where the light was better, but the process had become more complicated than he anticipated. He pushed, the table resisted, then moved, a dull scrape. He adjusted his grip, tried again. Another scrape, a slight lift this time, then a sharper sound as one leg came down more abruptly than intended. Thomas exhaled, stepping back. "This is ridiculous," he said, though there was no one to hear him. He stood there for a moment, looking at the table as though it had somehow contributed to the difficulty. Then, more carefully, he adjusted it again, making smaller movements, attempting to minimize the sound. But even then, a faint drag, a soft thud. He paused. There was a moment, brief but distinct, when he became aware of something beyond the immediate task, a sense of being heard. He straightened slightly, his head turning almost imperceptibly toward the wall. The house was quiet, and yet he found himself imagining the woman next door, sitting perhaps in her chair, listening. The thought carried with it a faint, unexpected irritation. He had every right, he told himself, to arrange his own furniture, to move within his own space. The idea that such a simple act might intrude upon someone else's quiet. It was unreasonable, and yet he could not entirely dismiss it. He placed his hands on the edge of the table, steadying it. For a moment he considered leaving it where it was, but the angle was wrong. The light did not fall properly. It would bother him. He knew this with a certainty that felt both justified and faintly absurd. He pushed again, more carefully this time, a smaller movement, a softer sound, and then a knock, not loud, but unmistakable. Thomas froze. The sound came from the front of the house, 3 short taps, measured, deliberate. He stood very still, his hands still resting on the table, as though the position itself might delay what he knew would follow. Another knock. He exhaled slowly. "Well?" he said, though the word carried no resolution. He moved toward the door, his steps quieter now, as though the act of approaching might somehow soften the moment. When he opened it, Margaret stood on the porch, her posture straight, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then, "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Her tone was polite, measured, but beneath it there was something else, something firmer. Thomas held the door open slightly wider. "No," he said, "not at all." Margaret inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging the space she had been given. "I wondered," she said, "if perhaps you might be moving something." Thomas felt a small tightening in his jaw. "Yes," he said, "a table." Margaret nodded. "I see." A pause. "It's just that the sound carries," she added, her voice still even, but now more precise, "particularly in the evening." Thomas considered this. For a moment he felt the impulse to respond, to explain, to justify, to assert the simple fact of his own presence, but the words did not come. Instead he said, "I wasn't aware of that." Margaret held his gaze. "No," she said, "one often isn't." The words settled between them, not sharp enough to wound, but not entirely without edge. Thomas nodded once. "I'll be more careful," he said. Margaret inclined her head again. "Thank you." Another pause, and then, as though recognizing that nothing further could be said without altering the balance of the moment, she stepped back slightly. "Well," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied. She turned, moving down the steps with the same measured pace she had approached with, and crossed the yard without looking back. Thomas remained in the doorway for a moment longer, his hand resting on the edge of the door. Then, slowly, he closed it. The house settled around him once more, but the silence, when it returned, was no longer entirely his own. In the days after the knock on the door, the air between the two houses altered in a way that was not immediately visible, yet could be felt in the smallest adjustments, like a room that had been aired out but not entirely cleared of its previous scent. Margaret noticed it first in the quality of the evenings. Where before there had been the intermittent sounds of movement, unpredictable, sometimes faintly irritating, there was now a careful restraint, as though the house next door had drawn in its breath and chosen quite deliberately not to release it. At first she told herself this was preferable. She sat in her usual chair, her hands folded loosely around a cup that had long since cooled, and listened. Nothing, no dragging of furniture, no uneven steps, not even the small incidental sounds that come with simply existing in a space. The quiet was complete, and yet, after a time she found that it pressed against her in a different way. "Well?" she murmured, shifting slightly in her seat. "This is what you wanted." The words sounded reasonable, measured, but something in them rang hollow. She glanced, almost without intending to, toward the wall that separated her from the neighbouring house. It stood there, as it always had, solid, unremarkable, but now it seemed to hold something within it, a kind of withheld presence. She took a sip of her tea and winced slightly at the temperature. Cold. She set the cup down more firmly than necessary. The sound echoed briefly in the room, sharper than she intended. For a moment she remained very still, her hand resting on the table, and then nothing followed. No corresponding shift, no faint acknowledgment from the other side. Margaret exhaled slowly. "Of course not," she said. But even as she spoke she became aware of something else, not sound exactly, but the absence of it as a kind of presence in itself. It unsettled her in a way she had not anticipated. That afternoon the sky cleared for the first time in several days, and the light returned in a thin pale wash that seemed to reveal more than it warmed. Margaret found herself outside again, though she could not have said exactly why. The yard looked much the same as it always did, the grass uneven, the fence leaning with its familiar patient fatigue. But there was something in the clarity of the light that made the details sharper, more defined. She moved slowly along the edge of the house, her hand brushing lightly against the siding as though confirming his presence. At the fence, she paused. On the other side, Thomas stood near the back steps, a small tool in his hand, a screwdriver perhaps, though he did not appear to be using it. Instead, he was looking at the door, his expression not quite focused, as though his attention were directed somewhere just beyond it. Margaret hesitated. For a moment, she considered turning back, allowing the moment to pass unnoticed. But then, "You've gone quiet," she said. The words left her before she had fully decided to speak them. Thomas turned, his gaze settling on her with a faint delay, as though he had needed a moment to shift from one kind of attention to another. "Yes," he said. A pause. "I suppose I have." Margaret rested her hand on the top of the fence, her fingers tracing the roughness of the wood. "It's noticeable," she added. Thomas inclined his head slightly. "I didn't want to disturb anything." The phrasing struck her, not because of its meaning, but because of its caution. Margaret considered this. "Well," she said, "a certain amount of disturbance is natural." Thomas looked at her more directly now. "Is it?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away toward the yard. "It reminds one that there are other people," she said, her tone lighter than she felt. Thomas's grip on the tool shifted slightly. "I thought that was the problem." Margaret let out a small breath, something that might almost have been a quiet laugh, though it carried no real amusement. "It can be," she said, "and it can also be the solution." The words lingered between them, more exposed than she intended. For a moment neither spoke. Then Thomas nodded, once, as though acknowledging something he had not fully understood, but recognized none the less. "I see," he said. Margaret withdrew her hand from the fence. "Well," she added, her voice returning to its usual steadiness, "there's no need to rearrange your entire house on my account." Thomas allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear, not fully formed, but present. "That's good to know," he said. She inclined her head slightly. "Yes." Another pause. And then, as though the moment had reached its natural limit, she turned and walked back toward her house, her steps slow and even. Behind her, Thomas remained where he was for a moment longer, before turning back toward the door. That evening, the sounds returned, not as they had been before, abrupt, uneven, but softer, more contained. A step. A chair moved, but only slightly, the faint placing of an object on a surface. Margaret sat in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, and listened. This time the sounds did not irritate her. They settled into the room, not as intrusions, but as quiet confirmations. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that brief darkness the house felt, if not full, then at least less empty than it had before. Thomas found, somewhat to his surprise, that he began to time certain parts of his day without fully acknowledging that he was doing so. It was not a deliberate act. He did not look at the clock and make decisions based on what he expected to happen next. And yet, he noticed, for instance, that he tended to step outside in the late afternoon, at roughly the same hour each day, when the light shifted just enough to soften the edges of the yard. At first, he told himself it was for the air. The house, still in the process of being settled into, held a faint, lingering scent of dust and cardboard, of things recently moved but not yet fully placed. Outside the air was clearer, cooler, but after a few days he became aware that there was something else, an expectation, not strong enough to be named, but present. He would step onto the back porch, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe, and pause, listening, not for any specific sound, but for the possibility of one. On one such afternoon, the sky had taken on that peculiar, muted brightness that sometimes followed a night of rain. The ground was still slightly damp, and the scent of wet earth rose faintly with each step. Thomas stood near the fence, his hands in his pockets, his gaze directed toward the narrow strip of yard that separated his house from Margaret's. The fence itself seemed more fragile in this light, its lean more pronounced, its wood softened by time and weather. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, how long it would stand. And then a sound, the back door opening. He did not turn immediately. Instead, he remained where he was, allowing the awareness of her presence to settle before acknowledging it. Margaret stepped into the yard, a small watering can in her hand. She moved slowly, her steps measured as though each one had been considered in advance. The can tilted slightly as she walked, and a thin line of water spilled over the edge, darkening the ground in irregular patches. Thomas watched for a moment, then shifted his weight. "You're watering the ground," he said. The words came out more abruptly than he intended. Margaret paused. She looked down at the can, then at the damp earth beneath her feet. "So it would seem," she replied. There was a brief silence. "I hadn't noticed," she added after a moment, her tone neutral, but not without a faint edge. Thomas felt a small tightening in his chest. "I didn't mean—" He stopped. The sentence did not complete itself. Margaret adjusted her grip on the handle of the watering can. "It's already wet," he said, as though clarification might repair what had already been said. "Yes," she replied, "it is." Another pause. The air between them seemed to hold the words in place, neither resolving nor dissipating. Thomas exhaled slowly. "I suppose it doesn't need any more," he said. Margaret looked at him then, not sharply, but with a steadiness that made the moment feel more significant than it was. "Some things don't," she said. The words settled with a quiet weight. Thomas nodded, though he was not entirely certain what he was agreeing to. Margaret set the watering can down on the ground, the metal making a soft, hollow sound as it met the damp earth. "I've always watered in the afternoon," she added after a moment. "It's a habit." Thomas glanced at the can, then back at her. "Even when it's not necessary?" Margaret's expression did not change, especially then. He considered this. There was something in her tone, not defensive but firm, that suggested the habit was not simply about the act itself. "I see," he said. Another silence followed, not uncomfortable exactly, but filled with something that neither of them chose to name. Then, almost as if the moment had tilted slightly too far towards something unguarded, Margaret turned away. "Well," she said, her voice returning to its usual composed cadence. "It's done now." Thomas nodded. "Yes." She picked up the watering can again, though she did not use it, and began to walk back toward the house. Halfway there, she paused. For a moment, it seemed as though she might turn back, might say something more, but she did not. Instead, she continued on, disappearing inside, the door closing behind her with a soft, final sound. Thomas remained by the fence for a while longer. The yard was quiet again, the damp earth dark beneath the fading light. He looked down at the place where the water had spilled, the irregular pattern it had left behind. Especially then, he repeated softly. The phrase lingered. There was something in it that unsettled him, not because it was unclear, but because it felt, in some way, familiar. A habit maintained beyond necessity, an action repeated not for its outcome, but for what it preserved. He shifted his weight, his foot pressing slightly into the softened ground. Then, after a moment, he turned and went back inside. That evening, as the light across the way appeared once more in Margaret's window, Thomas found himself standing at his own, watching, not directly, but in the same oblique way she had, allowing the reflection of his own room to overlay the faint glow beyond. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting lightly on the frame, and though nothing moved, though no figure appeared, the presence remained, not distant, not entirely separate, but close enough that, for reasons he did not fully understand, he did not turn away. It was Margaret who first noticed the light, not its presence, because that, by now, had become part of the quiet structure of her evenings, but its absence. The realization came slowly, almost reluctantly, as though her mind resisted drawing attention to something that might disturb the fragile arrangement she had come to rely on. She had been sitting, as she often did, with her cup resting in her hands, its warmth long faded, her gaze drifting, not directly, never directly, toward the window. There should have been a light across the way. There was not. She shifted slightly in her chair, leaning forward just enough to bring the neighbouring house more clearly into view. The window that usually held that dim, steady glow was dark now, reflecting only the faint outline of her own room layered against the night. Margaret frowned. "Well," she said softly, though the word carried no particular meaning. She told herself that there were many explanations, that people turned off lights, that routines changed, that absence did not necessarily indicate anything beyond itself. And yet she remained where she was, her hands tightening slightly around the cup, as though the gesture might anchor her in the moment. The house around her seemed to register the difference as well. The silence was not deeper, not louder, but altered in some subtle way she could not quite articulate. She set the cup down carefully, the porcelain meeting the table with a soft, controlled sound. Then she stood. Outside the air had grown sharper, carrying the first real edge of cold. Margaret stepped onto the porch and paused, the wooden boards beneath her feet holding the day's last traces of warmth. The street was quiet, the houses on either side withdrawn into themselves, their windows dim or dark. She moved slowly toward the edge of her yard, her gaze fixed, not quite directly, on the neighbouring house. No light, no movement. The windows held only the faint, indistinct reflection of the street lamp at the corner. Margaret hesitated. There was no reason, she told herself, to do anything further, no obligation, no expectation, and yet she found herself walking toward the fence. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, the grass damp and slightly slick. She placed her hand on the top of the fence, the wood cool and rough against her palm. "Mr. Avery?" she called. Her voice sounded unfamiliar in the open air, thinner, perhaps, than it did within the walls of her house. There was no response. She waited, listened, nothing. Margaret exhaled slowly. "Well?" she murmured, though, again, the word did not resolve anything. She stood there for a moment longer, her hand still resting on the fence, her gaze fixed on the dark window. Then, just as she was about to turn away, a sound, faint, from within the house, a shift, not movement exactly, but something that suggested presence. Margaret straightened slightly. "Mr. Avery," she called again, a little louder this time. There was a pause, and then a light, not the steady one she had grown accustomed to, but a brief, uneven flicker, as though a lamp had been switched on and then adjusted. A figure moved across the window, slower than before, less certain. Margaret felt something loosen slightly in her chest, though she did not name it. After a moment the door opened. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his posture slightly unsteady, as though he had risen too quickly or from too long a stillness. "Yes?" he said. Margaret remained where she was, her hand still on the fence. "I noticed the light," she said. Thomas glanced back toward the house, then toward her. "I turned it off," he replied. "Yes," Margaret said. "I saw that." A pause. "I thought, perhaps—" She stopped, the sentence trailing off before it had fully formed. Thomas waited. Then, after a moment, he said, "I fell asleep." The words seemed simple, but something in his tone, something faintly strained, suggested otherwise. Margaret considered this. "In the evening," she said. "Yes." Another pause. The air between them felt thinner now, the distance more noticeable. "Well," Margaret said at last, her voice returning to its usual steadiness. "It's colder tonight," Thomas nodded. "Yes." Neither of them moved. Then, as though the moment had reached its limit, Margaret withdrew her hand from the fence. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she added. "You didn't." A brief silence. "Good night," she said. "Good night." She turned, walking back toward her house with the same measured pace, though her steps felt slightly less certain now, as though something had shifted in a way she could not yet account for. Behind her, Thomas remained on the porch for a moment longer before going back inside. The light returned, but it was not quite the same. That night, Margaret lay awake longer than usual. The house seemed to hold its silence more tightly, as though guarding something. From time to time she thought she heard movement next door, faint, indistinct, but she could not be sure. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, and for the first time since Thomas had arrived, she found herself wishing, not for noise exactly, but for something more certain than this, something that did not flicker. The following morning began with a kind of quiet imbalance, as though the day itself had not settled properly into place. Thomas woke later than he intended, the light already filtering through the thin curtains in a pale, diluted wash. For a moment he remained still, his awareness slow to gather, the edges of the room slightly indistinct. There was a heaviness in his body, not pain exactly, but a dull, lingering fatigue that seemed to have settled into his limbs overnight. He sat up carefully, placing his feet on the floor. The boards beneath him creaked, louder than usual. He paused, listened, nothing from next door. He exhaled slowly. Margaret, meanwhile, had been awake for some time. She stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the counter, watching the kettle as it began its gradual approach toward boiling. The sound built slowly, a soft rising hum that filled the space without overwhelming it. She found herself thinking of the night before, of the dark window, of the brief uneven light, of the way he had said, "I fell asleep." The words did not settle. They hovered, as though waiting to be understood. Margaret reached for the cup, placing it on the counter with more care than necessary. "Well," she said under her breath, "people do fall asleep." The statement was true, obvious, and yet she poured the water, watching the steam rise. Across the way the house remained quiet, too quiet. She turned toward the window. No movement, no sign. Margaret hesitated. Then, without quite deciding to do so, she set the cup down and moved toward the door. Thomas was in the kitchen when the knock came. He had just poured himself a cup of coffee, stronger than usual, as though he hoped the bitterness might cut through the dull heaviness that lingered in him. The sound startled him, not because it was loud, but because it came with a kind of certainty that he had not anticipated. 3 measured taps. He stood still for a moment, the cup held loosely in his hand. Then he set it down. The walk to the door felt longer than it had the previous evening, as though the space itself had stretched. When he opened it, Margaret stood there, her posture as composed as ever, though there was something in her expression, something slightly more intent. "Good morning," she said. Thomas nodded. "Morning." A pause. "I hope I'm not intruding," she added. The word lingered. Intruding. Thomas felt a small tightening in his chest. "No," he said. "It's fine." Margaret inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging the permission. "I wondered," she said, "if you were well." Thomas blinked. "Yes," he said, "I'm fine." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Margaret held his gaze. "You seemed unsteady," she said. Thomas felt something shift, an irritation, faint but present. "I was tired," he replied. Margaret did not look away. "Yes," she said. "You mentioned that." A pause. "It happens." The words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them, something that suggested they carried more weight than their surface meaning. Thomas nodded, though the motion felt less like agreement and more like an attempt to move the conversation forward. "Yes," he said, "it does." Another pause. The air between them seemed to tighten, as though the space itself were narrowing. Margaret's hands remained clasped in front of her. "Well," she said, her tone returning to its usual steadiness, though now with a faint edge. "I thought it best to check." Thomas felt the irritation sharpen slightly. "I appreciate that," he said, though the words carried a formality that bordered on distance. But it wasn't necessary. Margaret's expression did not change. "No," she said, "perhaps not." The pause that followed was longer, more pronounced, and within it something shifted, subtly but unmistakably, a misalignment, a small, almost imperceptible fracture in the careful balance that had begun to form between them. Margaret inclined her head once more. "Well," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied. She turned, stepping away from the door, her movements as measured as ever. Thomas watched her go, his hand still resting on the edge of the door. For a moment he considered calling after her, saying something to soften the moment, to adjust its shape, but the words did not come. Instead, he closed the door. Inside the house felt different, not quieter, but less contained. Thomas returned to the kitchen, his coffee still waiting on the counter. He lifted the cup, took a sip, and winced slightly at the temperature. It had cooled. He set it down again, more firmly than necessary. The sound echoed briefly, and then nothing. No corresponding shift, no faint acknowledgement from next door. Thomas stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the surface of the coffee. "Well," he said quietly, but the word did not settle. Across the way, Margaret sat in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. The book remained closed beside her. The house was quiet, completely, and for the first time since the sound of footsteps had entered her evenings, she found that the silence no longer felt shared. It had returned to something else, something older, and, in a way she could not fully explain, something more difficult to bear. The distance, once established, did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive with any clear declaration or rupture. Instead, it settled gradually, like a thin layer of dust that at first went unnoticed, until one day the surfaces of things no longer reflected light in quite the same way. Margaret felt it most in the mornings. There had been, in the previous weeks, a quiet expectancy to that hour, a subtle awareness that the day did not begin entirely alone. Even before she had admitted it to herself, she had listened for it. The faint suggestion of movement next door, the almost imperceptible confirmation that another person had risen, that another life had resumed its quiet course alongside her own. Now that expectancy was gone, or rather it had been replaced by something more deliberate, an absence that did not happen accidentally, but seemed almost chosen. She stood at the sink, rinsing her cup, her hands moving with the same practiced rhythm, though the motion felt slightly more pronounced, as though she were aware of it in a way she had not been before. There was no sound from next door, not the careful, restrained movements that had followed her visit, not even the earlier, more uneven disturbances. Nothing. Margaret set the cup in the rack and dried her hands, the towel rough against her skin. "Well," she said under her breath, though the word carried less conviction now. She moved to the window. The neighbouring house stood as it always had, unchanged, outwardly indifferent to whatever had shifted within it. The curtains remained half drawn, the light inside faint but present. "He is there," she thought, but the thought did not bring with it the same quiet steadiness it once had. Instead, it hovered, uncertain. Thomas, for his part, had become more precise, not quieter, though he was that as well, but more contained, as though each movement had been measured in advance and reduced to its most necessary form. He noticed it himself, though he did not dwell on it. When he walked across the room, he placed his feet more carefully, avoiding the boards he had come to recognize as particularly vocal. When he set objects down, he did so with a deliberateness that bordered on restraint, as though he were attempting not merely to minimize sound, but to eliminate the possibility of it altogether. It was not, he told himself, for her. Not exactly. It was simply easier this way. Less complicated, and yet there were moments when he found himself pausing, his hand hovering over a surface, his attention drawn outward in spite of himself, listening, not for anything specific, but for the absence of something he had once begun to expect. He would stand there, his breath held slightly, as though waiting, but nothing came, only the quiet, steady presence of his own house. That afternoon, the sky lowered into a uniform grey, the light flattening across the yards and houses, erasing the small distinctions that usually gave shape to the space. Margaret sat in her chair, her book open but unread, her gaze fixed not on the page, but somewhere just beyond it. She found herself thinking, though she did not quite allow the thought to fully form, of the conversation at the door, of the way he had said, "It wasn't necessary." The words had been polite, measured. And yet there had been something in them, a closing, perhaps, or a drawing of a line she had not realized she was approaching. Margaret shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket over her knees. "Well," she murmured, "one shouldn't assume." The statement was reasonable, correct, and yet it did not settle. Instead, it lingered, as though waiting for something more. She closed the book. For a moment she sat very still, her hands resting lightly on the cover. Then she stood. Thomas was at the sink when he heard the sound. Not a knock, not a voice, but something softer. A movement outside. He turned his head slightly, his attention shifting towards the back of the house. There was no clear reason to go to the window, and yet he did. Margaret stood near the fence, her hand resting lightly on the wood, her posture neither fully turned toward his house nor entirely away from it. She was not looking directly at the window. Instead, her gaze seemed to rest somewhere in the space between. Thomas remained where he was for a moment, his hand still on the edge of the sink. Then slowly he moved toward the door. When he stepped outside, the air felt heavier than usual, the dampness settling into his clothes almost immediately. Margaret did not turn at once. Instead, she remained as she was, her fingers tracing the uneven surface of the fence. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, before he had spoken. Thomas paused. The words were familiar, too familiar. "You said that," he replied. Margaret nodded slightly. "Yes." A pause. "I thought perhaps I should say it again." Thomas felt a faint tightening in his chest. "There's no need," he said. Margaret lifted her gaze then, meeting his. "There may be," she replied. The air between them seemed to hold the words, not allowing them to dissipate. Thomas shifted his weight. "I said it was fine," he added. "Yes," Margaret said. "You did." Another pause. "But you didn't mean it that way." The statement was quiet, not accusatory, but precise. Thomas looked at her for a moment, then away, his gaze settling on the yard. "I meant it," he said. Margaret's fingers stilled on the fence. "No," she said, "you didn't." The certainty in her voice unsettled him more than the words themselves. He felt suddenly as though something had been uncovered, something he had not intended to reveal. "You came to the door," he said, his tone sharper now, "to ask if I was well." "Yes." "I told you I was." "Yes." "And that wasn't enough." Margaret held his gaze. "It wasn't true," she said. The words landed with a quiet weight. Thomas felt the irritation rise more fully now, though beneath it there was something else, something less defined, more difficult to place. "You don't know that," he said. Margaret's expression did not change. "No," she replied, "I don't." A pause, but I recognized it. The phrase hung between them. Recognized. Thomas let out a short breath. "That's not the same thing," he said. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "No," she said, "it isn't." Another silence, longer this time, more exposed. Thomas felt the urge to step back, to return to the house, to close the door and allow the moment to resolve itself without further complication. But he did not move. Instead, he said, "You don't need to concern yourself with me." The words came out more firmly than he intended. Margaret's hand slipped from the fence. "No," she said quietly, "I don't." The agreement was immediate, uncomplicated, and for that reason more final than he had expected. She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Well," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied. She turned then, her step steady as she walked back toward her house. This time she did not pause, did not look back. Thomas remained where he was, his hands at his sides, the damp air settling around him. The yard seemed larger now, the distance between the houses more pronounced. He stood there for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned and went back inside. The days that followed did not return to what they had been before. They did not even return to what they had been in the brief period of quiet tension that had preceded the confrontation. Instead, they settled into something more defined, more separate. Margaret resumed her routines with a care that bordered on precision. She rose at the same hour, prepared her tea in the same way, sat in the same chair, the same blanket arranged across her knees with the same deliberate attention. From the outside, nothing had changed, and yet there was a difference in the way she moved through these actions, a slight tightening, a faint withdrawal, as though each gesture had been drawn closer to herself, contained more fully within her own space. She no longer lingered at the window. When she did look out, it was briefly, without the same drifting attention that had once allowed her gaze to settle across the way. The light in Thomas's house still appeared in the evenings, but she did not watch for it, or rather, she told herself she did not. Thomas, meanwhile, allowed the house to expand again. Not outwardly, its walls remained the same, but in the way he occupied it. He moved more freely now, no longer measuring each step, no longer placing objects with such careful restraint. The sounds returned, not loudly, not carelessly, but without the same deliberate containment. A chair shifted, a cupboard closed, footsteps crossed the floor without hesitation, and yet there was no corresponding awareness from next door, no sense of being heard, no quiet acknowledgement. At first, this felt like a kind of relief, a return to something simpler, but as the days passed, he found that the absence of that awareness carried its own weight. He would pause, at times, mid-movement, his attention turning outward, as it had before, listening, but there was nothing. Only the quiet, steady presence of his own actions contained entirely within his own space. One evening, as the light faded more quickly than expected, a wind began to move through the street, low and persistent, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves and the faint creak of branches. Margaret sat in her chair, her hands resting on the arms, her gaze fixed on the far wall. The house seemed to hold the sound of the wind differently than it held other sounds, allowing it in, but not fully containing it, so that it moved through the rooms in a way that felt both distant and close. She listened, not for the wind, but for something else, something that did not come. After a while she rose. The movement felt heavier than usual, as though the act of standing required more intention than it once had. She crossed the room and paused near the window. For a moment she stood there, her hand resting lightly on the frame. Then, slowly, she parted the curtain. The neighbouring house stood in the dim light, its window lid as it had been before. Steady, unchanged, Margaret looked at it for a long moment. Then she let the curtain fall back into place. "Well," she said softly, but the word did not carry. Across the way Thomas stood at his own window, his reflection layered faintly over the glass. He could see the outline of Margaret's house, the faint suggestion of movement when she crossed the room, but not clearly, never clearly. He watched for a moment, then turned away. The room behind him felt larger, emptier, though nothing had been removed. That night the wind continued. It moved along the fence, pressing lightly against its weakened structure, causing it to shift just enough to produce a soft, intermittent creak. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound carried between the two houses, passing through the narrow space that separated them. Neither Margaret nor Thomas named it. Neither rose to look. And yet, in the quiet of their separate rooms, each became aware of it, not as something external, but as something that seemed to echo faintly within. A movement, repeated, unresolved, and continuing. The cold came more suddenly than either of them had expected. It arrived in the early hours, settling into the walls and floors with a quiet insistence, so that by morning the houses no longer held warmth in the way they had the day before. The air felt thinner, sharper, and the small sounds, the turning of a faucet, the shifting of wood, carried more distinctly, as though the cold itself had drawn everything into clearer focus. Margaret noticed it first in her hands. She stood at the sink, waiting for the water to warm, her fingers resting beneath the thin stream, and felt how long it took, how the cold lingered, refusing to give way. "Well," she murmured, her breath faintly visible near the window. "It's come." She did not say what it was. There was no need. The house seemed to know. Later that morning she wrapped herself more carefully than usual before stepping outside. The yard had taken on a brittle quality, the grass stiff beneath her shoes, the fence edged with a faint line of frost that caught the pale light. She moved slowly, her breath measured, her gaze lowered. It was not until she reached the fence that she noticed something different. The door next door stood slightly open, not wide, just enough to suggest that it had not been fully closed. Margaret paused. There are many reasons a door might be left open, she told herself. A moment of distraction, a forgotten movement, nothing that required attention. And yet, she found herself standing there longer than necessary, her eyes returning to that narrow gap. "Mr. Avery," she called. Her voice carried differently in the cold air, clearer perhaps, but also more exposed. There was no response. Margaret hesitated. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, she moved along the fence, her steps slower now, more deliberate. "Thomas," she tried. The name felt unfamiliar again, as though it had receded in the days since she had last spoken it. Still no answer. The yard seemed to hold its breath. Margaret reached the gate, a narrow section of the fence that had long ago ceased to close properly. She placed her hand on it, feeling the cold seep into her palm. For a moment she remained still. Then she pushed. Inside the air felt different. Not colder exactly, but unsettled, holding the faint scent of something left unfinished. The light was dim, filtered through the half-drawn curtains, and the room bore the quiet disarray of a space interrupted mid-use. Margaret stepped carefully across the threshold. "Thomas," she called again, her voice softer now. There was a sound, from deeper within the house, a shift, then a low indistinct movement. She followed it, her steps measured, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as though confirming its presence. He was in the living room, sitting, or rather half-slumped, on the chair near the window, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other gripping the armrest with a tension that seemed out of place. His eyes were open, but unfocused. Margaret stopped a few feet away. For a moment she did not move. Something in the scene held her, not fear exactly, but a kind of stillness that demanded recognition. "Thomas," she said. His gaze shifted slowly, as though the act required effort. "Yes," he replied. The word came out uneven. Margaret took a step closer. "You've been sitting here," she said. It was not a question. Thomas blinked. "I suppose," he said. A pause. "I didn't mean to." The sentence drifted. Margaret looked at him more closely now. the slight pallor of his face, the way his shoulders had drawn inward, as though the cold had settled into him. "You're unwell," she said. Thomas's mouth tightened slightly. "No," he replied, though the word lacked conviction. Margaret did not argue. Instead, she moved past him, toward the window, and drew the curtain back further, allowing more light into the room. The change was immediate, not dramatic, but enough. Then she turned back. "You've been sitting in the cold," she said. Thomas glanced toward the window, as though only now aware of the dimness. "It's fine," he murmured. Margaret shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "it isn't." There was no sharpness in her voice, only certainty. She moved towards the kitchen without waiting for a response, her steps steady, her attention already shifting toward what needed to be done. The kettle, the cupboard, the quiet practiced movements of care that did not announce themselves as such. Behind her, Thomas remained where he was. For a moment he seemed about to speak, but he did not. Instead, he sat there, his gaze following her, the room around him slowly altering, not in its structure, but in its meaning. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but enough. When Margaret returned, she placed the cup in his hand. He did not take it immediately. Instead, his fingers hovered slightly, as though uncertain of the gesture. "You should drink," she said. He looked at the cup, then at her. "You came in," he said. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Yes." A pause. "You didn't knock?" "No." Another pause. Thomas's grip on the armrest loosened slightly. "That's not—" he began, then stopped. Margaret did not respond. She simply stood there, her hands now empty, her presence steady. After a moment, Thomas took the cup. The warmth seemed to register slowly, his fingers tightening around it as though rediscovering something. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said. Margaret considered him. "No," she replied, "I shouldn't." The agreement was simple, unadorned, and yet it did not carry refusal. Thomas lowered his gaze to the cup. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, quietly, almost as though the words had arrived without permission, he said, "I didn't want to be seen like this." Margaret's expression did not change. "I know," she said. The room held the words, not as resolution, but as something closer to truth. After that morning, nothing returned to what it had been before. And yet, nothing resolved itself entirely either. Margaret did not speak of what had happened. She did not refer to it, did not frame it as an event that required acknowledgement or explanation. Instead, she continued as she always had, but with a slight difference. She began quietly to leave her back door unlocked during the day, not open, not visibly so, but unlatched. The gesture was small, almost invisible, and yet it altered something in the way the house held itself. Thomas, for his part, moved more slowly in the days that followed. Not out of weakness exactly, but with a kind of awareness that had not been present before. He noticed things, the way the light entered the room in the late afternoon, the faint sound of Margaret's movements next door, not frequent but enough, the kettle, the cupboard door, the soft placing of a cup. He did not respond to these sounds, but he did not ignore them either. They existed alongside him. A few days later he stepped outside. The cold had settled more fully now, the yard edged with frost in the early hours, the air carrying that particular stillness that comes before winter takes hold entirely. Margaret was already there, standing near the fence, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. For a moment neither spoke. Then, "You left the door open," he said. Margaret glanced toward her house. "Yes." A pause. "It happens," she added. Thomas nodded. "Yes." They stood there, the space between them unchanged, and yet not entirely the same. "I should have closed it," he said. After a moment, Margaret looked at him. "You did," she replied. Thomas frowned slightly. "I did. Yes." A brief silence. "Oh," he said. Margaret inclined her head. "Yes." The words carried something unspoken. Not quite reassurance, not quite correction, but something in between. Later that afternoon, Margaret found a small bag on her back step. It contained 2 apples, nothing more, no note, no indication of intention. She stood there for a moment, the bag in her hand, the cold air settling around her. "Well?" she said softly. She brought them inside, washed them, and placed one on the table. The other she left untouched. Winter came fully, though not all at once. It arrived in increments. The first real frost that held through the morning, the thinning of light in the late afternoon, the quiet way the ground hardened beneath repeated cold. The houses adjusted. They always did. The walls held the warmth more tightly, the floors creaked differently, the sounds within them carrying in altered ways. Margaret sat in her chair one evening, her hands wrapped around a cup that she did not drink from. Across the way the light was on, steady, unflickering. She did not look at it directly, but she knew it was there. Thomas stood at his window, not watching, not exactly, but present. The reflection of his own room layered faintly over the glass, the outline of Margaret's house just visible beyond it. He had not spoken to her that day, nor the day before, and yet there was a sense, difficult to name, that something remained, not fixed, not defined, but present. The fence between the yards shifted slightly in the wind. A soft, familiar creak, back and forth, back and forth. Margaret heard it. Thomas did too. Neither moved to steady it. Neither stepped outside. And yet the sound carried between them, as it always had, passing through the narrow space that separated their lives. On a morning not long after, Margaret placed the second apple on the back step. She did not knock, did not wait. She simply set it down and returned inside, closing the door with her usual care. The gesture was small, almost nothing, and yet it remained. That evening, the light across the way dimmed slightly, then steadied again. Margaret sat in her chair, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She thought, not clearly, not in words, of all that had not been said, of the moments that had passed just short of something more, of the things that had been recognized but not named. "Well," she murmured. The word carried no conclusion. Across the way Thomas stood for a long moment before turning away from the window. The room behind him held its quiet, not empty, not full, but inhabited in a way that was not entirely solitary. The night settled. The houses held their warmth. The fence creaked once more, then stilled. And in the space between them, unchanged and yet altered, something remained, not resolved, not complete, but enough.